Hey guys. Okay, so I want to do this one kind of fast. I don't want us to spend the next couple weeks kind of focused on, feminist critiques of science and critical science studies. Uh, you should get a taste of this stuff in this course. You should understand it, and there's a lot of historical things that are important that happened because of critical science studies. We talked about the science wars. We talked about the place of the humanities in academia, and that that kind of still ongoing tension between, I guess, the STEM disciplines and the arts, and there's some legitimate reasons for that. In class, we also went very carefully through like a history of people thinking about gender, and in particularly, we put that in the context of Jennifer Saul's paper and Okrulik's paper, both of which are assigned, right? And they're both trying to make this point that when we look at the history of the sciences, particularly around people talking about race and people talking about sex, the claims that get made are not just sort of like people reading off of the data, right? It's not like we observed the world and that led us to think about women in a certain way, or it led us to think about our races in a certain way, or it led us to think about men in a certain way, right? The point that the critical science people are drawing over and over again is the way in which we've come to understand things like sex and our genders and our relationships with each other are not solely a matter of people applying a scientific model, but ideological commitments and value commitments and general paradigms about what it is we're observing and we're looking at. And those things have shaped because they shape our worldviews, right? But they've also shaped how we understand the data that we're looking at, how we theorize about things, what things we think are worth taking seriously, and which theories we think are dismissible. And that's Okrulik's really general point, right? Is that it's just objectively false to think that the history of science is one of sort of like the best theory always winning out, or the data always pointing to one thing and then people taking that perspective. That's not what's happened historically, right? And that's her claim. um, Now we gave a rough history, right? And we said, look, we started, during the, like with the Platonists, right? And we started with this view of humanity, um, where there was sort of like one perfect shared humanity that was realized in radically different ways in men and women, right? Women were, more defective than males, right? But we were all understood as imitations of a more perfect platonic form of human or something like that, right? And that's where for the authors we're looking at this view of sex and gender sort of gets started, right? There's one essential humanity that is realized in different ways, right? That's eventually replaced after the scientific revolution, particularly during the Victorian age. We said by a scientific construction of sex and of race. And we spent a lot of time looking at examples of that, right? Whether it's exaggeration of sexual differences, to sort of make a point. Women are this way, women are smaller, they're weaker, they're passive, men are more aggressive, more masculine, more whatever, right? But those again are not just people reading off the data or the best theory of gender and sex sort of winning out, or like just some sort of objective truth that there are two distinct sexes that are exactly like these kind of stereotypical male and stereotypical females are. It turns out that so much of that is just sort of people applying gender ideologies and value claims to the world that they're interpreting, right? And we looked at a lot of that in class, right? And then Okrulik's, I think, ending at a place in her paper where she's arguing, and things have changed quite significantly today. Today, we're probably, for a whole bunch of reasons, in a world where we think about things like race and gender as more fluid, right? Um, where we have a much more complicated view of, I think, what it means to be human and to sort of realize, to express your identity. whether it comes to your gender or something else. At least in some circles, people seem to be, and not just like, critical science theorists or something like that, but just in general, right? Like academics, people seem to be moving away from this idea of binary distinctions, including scientists looking at these things, but they're not going back to the kind of essentialist. The feminine is a natural property and the masculine is a natural property that we saw in the 18th century. At least the academics aren't, right? The hard lines between these categories are increasingly challenged, and we're moving towards something that seems to be spectrums, right? And that's where she tries to get to, right? And she has a bunch of arguments, a bunch of examples. We've looked at most of those. And so that's what's going on in her paper. That's what's going on in Saul's paper. I took out this stuff on primatology, right, and anthropology, where, in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at people trying to understand the natural world and trying to understand animals, and then, bringing their own biases to what they're looking at, and then the kind of complications that come out of that. I think the work that she did on primatology in particular, and that the history there will fit better in that section of the course. So we'll come back to that material a little later. But for now, that's all we want from here. Next week, we are looking at that Tanner lecture, right? And we're going to look at why we should trust science in general. And that paper does a really nice job of sort of bringing together a whole bunch of different themes that we've looked at in this course. And she'll talk at length about people like Helen Lodginall, who I'm going to bring up here in a moment. So what I really want to do in this video is just really quickly recap and overview what feminist epistemology is in relationship to the sciences, right? So in this sections, we've looked at a number of things, right? We've looked at science studies, what it was, how it comes out of the Kuhnian revolution, and sort of what the critical science studies people are doing. We've looked at the science wars and sort of what was going on at that, in that 1980s sort of period in academia in general, and why there was such a conflict between the people doing critical science studies and then sort of like practicing scientists, for better or worse. We looked at the Sokal hoax, right? And the more modern Sokal hoaxes. We should think about those and talk about those. And then we looked at very specific feminist critiques of the sciences, right? As an example of people doing this kind of work. Saul and Okerluk's work talked through that at length. Two other themes we want to talk about here. We're going to talk about feminist epistemology. So these are going to be feminist theories of what knowledge is and how it gets constructed. There's going to be a couple theories here, and they're going to apply them to science. And so we're going to talk about that. The last kind of feminist critique that we might bring up in this part of a course like this would be feminist critiques of specific sciences. Now, I included a paper by Cordelia Fine. She's a cognitive neuroscientist. She works, in Australia. She, she's got a really strong background in philosophy of science and critical science studies, and she's also, got, her PhD, in neuroscience, right? She's an expert on the brain. So I thought her work is a good example of the kind of stuff that is of high value in this area of academia, right? We're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about what she has to say in class, but if you're interested, there's her paper to read. It's really straightforward, and I think I got another video on it, right? But what she's talking about is this idea that there's the brain itself is gendered, right? And sort of how some segments of neuroscience came to believe that, and why she thinks that that's largely pseudoscience. And so she's doing feminist critical studies of science by applying, philosophical critique that's well informed by the relevant empirical sciences to make claims about how the science can be better done, right? And how the science is making claims that are unjustifiable given the data. Really useful part, I think, of critical studies. Okay, feminist epistemology. We want to say a little bit here. And really what we're trying to get to is Helen Loginal, right? So, throughout this course, we've looked at different people trying to give an account of what exactly is science? What are the scientists doing? Why is science so successful? What's the method, right? And then we've sort of gone through this moment here where people sort of pulled back and they were looking at science as kind of a political phenomenon. They're looking at scientists as groups of people and, the kind of inherent biases in science. Feminist epistemology is sort of going to go back to that original question: what's the method of the sciences, right? What exactly is it the scientists are doing? But they're also going to be critical in the way that we've seen this group of people be, right? So again, we could spend a whole course on this kind of stuff. I really want to talk about Helen Loginal's contextual empiricism, and I want to talk about feminist standpoint theory. So one way to think about what's going on with feminist epistemology, again, we've talked about epistemology in this class, right? Epistemology are theories of knowledge, theories of how we come to know things. Feminists, again, it's going to be this critical approach to general epistemology, right? They're going to say, in virtue of somebody's gender, for some reason, there's certain kinds of things they can or can't know, or there's certain kinds of critiques we can make of traditional epistemology because it's not paying attention to things like gender or social position or something like that. You get this view called standpoint epistemology that gets developed here, right? A standpoint epistemologist is going to say that, how might we say this? I guess how you are socially situated impacts you as a knower, right? It impacts your ability to both know things, and it gives you access to certain kinds of information that you might not otherwise have, right? So somebody that is a standpoint epistemologist is going to stress the situatedness of the knower, right? They're going to say it's sort of a mistake to take this perspective on knowledge, I guess, that the early thinkers in this course were taking, where to know is just sort of like some objective method, and who you are and where you are is irrelevant, right? It's just like if you apply the methodology, you're going to know. And I mean, that's obviously not true, right? Like somebody today cannot just apply the right scientific method and know, I don't know, the inner workings of the I don't know, the nature of time and space, like fundamental. Like we just don't have enough knowledge available to us. We don't have enough data, right? Like our starting point is the fundamental nature of time is like, that's not an interesting question to ask today, because we are nowhere near kind of even having a way to conceptualize that in a productive way. This is not going to be a good example. Sorry. Really simple example. 200 years ago, it would have been, let's just stick to simple stuff. As a dude, I have no way of ever possibly knowing what it's like to be pregnant, right? There's a simple example, right? My standpoint, says the standpoint epistemologist, prevents me from knowing certain kinds of things. I can hypothetically imagine what it would be like to be pregnant, but that's not what it's actually like to be pregnant, right? There's certain kind of knowledge there that's just inaccessible to me, given my situatedness. Likewise, I'll never know what it's like to be a bat, right? I'll never know what it's like to experience reality in terms of sonar, right? Those are, that's so radically different than the way in which I perceive and the way in which I am, that to sort of access that experience and access the kind of knowledge that would be involved in knowing the world in virtue of sonar would be like it'd be just make believing, right? Like it's outside my standpoint. And what the feminist epistemologist said, right, is as knowers, we are always situated. We know from a perspective. There are things we cannot know right now in virtue of our situation. That doesn't make knowledge subjective, right? It just means your position is contextual, right? You have a specific position and you can know certain things from that position. Knowledge isn't relative. It just means you are limited no matter how much you might not want to be, right? Um, Certain people also have privileged access to information in virtue of their standpoint, right? And I mean, that makes sense. If you work in a big bureaucracy or in institutions, certain individuals in that institution have access to information that most people there don't, right? The chief financial officer has access to all sorts of data that the average employee doesn't have, right? And so they will think differently and they will know things that other employees won't. Likewise for middle managers, right? Middle managers will have perspectives on how management thinks and how employees think. And like a CEO in that business is not going to have the same access to information that they do, right? They won't have that integration of sort of like the ground up and the top down that they get from being in that unique position. And the employees at the bottom, right? The workers in the business will have a radically different perspective on how the institution's going, and what's sort of wrong with it and what's working well than the C-suite executives will, right? We all have a different situatedness, and standpoint theorists are really just pointing to that, right? Is our position within the world gives us access to certain experiences, certain pieces of information, certain ways of thinking that aren't available to people that just don't have our experience. And the C-suite executive can imagine what it's like to, you know, um, be one of the employees, but it's just them imagining. They don't really know, right? Which is, and you think about like a billionaire or somebody like that trying to understand what it's like to live off of like 30 grand a year or something like that, right? Like, no way they can possibly have that perspective, right? um, or like, I don't know, you think about your parents, thinking that they know what it's like to be a young person, paying exorbitant prices for university and then trying to get a job today, right? Like they just we don't know, right? We're from a different world. Our experiences are radically different. Today, when people talk about things like white privilege or first world problems or checking your privilege or even like personal truths, they're appealing to this kind of an epistemology, right? They're appealing to the idea that from a certain perspective, you either get access to extra kinds of information or you are deprived access to things, not, out of anything malicious or intentional necessarily, but just in virtue of your situation, there's certain things you can and cannot know, right? Um, Feminist epistemologists tended to also add to that marginalized voices often have a unique privilege when it comes to certain kinds of knowledge, particularly about the ways in which they are marginalized or the ways in which they are oppressed, right? And so they typically thought then that somebody that's racialized or somebody that's othered, or somebody that's again not a privileged, wealthy white male kind of thing. Again, that's not to say all men are, somehow lesser, or all men are bad, or being a man is like, it's not to say anything about that. But it's just to say, if somebody is oppressed in virtue of being oppressed, they know certain things about what it's like to be oppressed that their oppressor can't possibly know, right? So there's things about that perspective that are unique and valuable. And if you want to sort of work for social justice, understandably, those things are important, right? What the feminist epistemologist applied to science would be saying, right, is like, if we want to sort of accurately understand the world we inhabit, we have to include these perspectives that have been traditionally marginalized or left out, right? We all the thinkers we've been looking at in this section, right? They've critiqued the sciences by saying there's experiences, there's data, there's ideas, there's paradigms, there's perspectives that are just not on the table because people that would entertain those are left, out. And science in general suffers for that, right? So that's a like an epistemic critique of the sciences that somebody might make, right? A really important thinker sort of working in this tradition is Helen Longino, who developed something called contextual empiricism, the late 90s, early 2000s, I think. I was a grad student at the time when this came out. Anyways, so she thinks, look, okay, there's something to this idea of the standpoint theorists. There is something that woman can offer to the sciences that is been typically left on the cutting room floor. But what we have to do is really sort of understand that properly. What is the contribution that the marginalized voice can add, that woman can add, I guess that men add or can add as well, right? And she says, well, think about it. There's different pools of ideas available. If we had a blackboard, I'd be drawing a bunch of Venn diagrams, right? But there's different pools of ideas that are available to people in different positions and different points of views, right? And again, intuitively, that makes sense. Think about our bureaucracy again. There's certain things the CEO is going to think about that the others employees are probably not going to at all. And there's ideas they'll entertain that none of their employees would, right? Because they've got this radically different position, right? Like crazy people like Elon Musk, right? They live in their own little fantasy worlds, right? That just come with kind of having that kind of wealth and privilege. And they'll think these crazy things that sometimes are useful that other people wouldn't think, right? Because like nobody's going to think, oh, let's go put data centers on the moon or Mars or something like that. And those are probably horrible ideas, but they wouldn't occur to the average worker, right? Nobody would think that. But somebody with that kind of wealth, that's a possibility to them. So it's something they would entertain, right? But we're all like that, right? We all have a different pool of ideas that are available to us given our perspective, given our context, given our standpoint. None of us can be sort of like this idealized, detached observer that so much of like traditional epistemology or even like traditional models of science wanted us to have, right? We are always knowing from a perspective. So it's similar in some ways to holism when we were talking about that, but it's different. So the idea is not the only way to have an observation is, from a theoretical framework. It's rather given where you are situated, given your context, there's certain things that are plausible or live options maybe for you. And then there's certain things that are not, right? But if you sort of want to be less wrong about the world, right, you got to bring all these different groups together and then you got to collaboratively work through them, right? So really she's appealing to wide reflective equilibrium, right? She's like, we bring all the sort of different pools of thought and thinkers together. We and then we start challenging and entertaining and sort of intertwining, into a really elaborate mosaic. And we try to make it coherent and consistent. And with this diversity, you're getting closer to the truth. You're going to end up less wrong about what you think about reality because you're not marginalizing, right? And I mean, that makes sense in all sorts of domains, right? You think about news or politics, right? And again, she's not saying something like both side this, right? We got to have somebody that's on the left and somebody on the right, or, somebody that's an anti-vaxxer and somebody that's pro-vaccines, and then, give them equal time. That's not what she's saying, right? But what she is saying is, given our perspectives, given our situations, we all have radically different information available to us, different data, different theories would entertain different facts. Bring that all together and then sort of work through it collectively, right? It's not giving the illusion of impartiality. It's not denying expertise or anything like that, but it is saying there's certain things you won't consider that are worth considering. That if you want to get at the truth, you need to bring together. So that's it. So that's what Longino is saying, right? And then she's arguing when Science is at its best. This is the project it's engaged in. It's engaged in this social epistemology where people from radically different perspectives are sort of bringing their pools of ideas together and then collectively, applying this kind of scientific methodology to get closer to the truth, right? Or at least to be less wrong about the theories that we endorse, right? And this is coming out of the feminist epistemic tradition, right? Personally, I think this is a really probably fairly close to getting at like a very plausible model of what sort of goes on in the sciences at its best. So I guess that's the final critique we wanted to look at then of science from the feminist perspective. Okay, so we'll talk next week. Have a good one.